Good afternoon, everyone. Originally, when I was asked to make some remarks, I was going to be introducing Mr. Sutherland, and I had this perplexing moment thinking, how do you introduce a man in a building named after him? And I don't have to do that, so I'm relieved now. I just wanted to make a couple of introductory remarks and then maybe take any questions you may have, and I'll also try and respond to some of the messages and questions that came up earlier, particularly around this issue about definition of migrant and refugee or person who's in need of protection. But just to start off, I think it's true that there couldn't be a more topical issue for your event. This is the 18th event, as I understand it, and it couldn't be more timely or more topical. This is the issue that is dominating the political and legal discourse agenda in Europe at the moment. And today marks 37 days since the death of Aylan Kurdi, and those images that so captured the tragedy and the enormity of what's happening in Europe. And since then we've seen a mass of extraordinary meetings in Geneva, in Brussels and in New York with officials, heads of state and ministers scrambling to try and catch up and put in place some measures to respond to the crisis. This is very much a moment that calls for vision, for leadership and for partnership, and I think it's really something quite special that you managed to have Peter Sutherland here today, given his standing and his role and his partnership work, as he mentioned, together with the quartet of IOM, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and my boss, the High Commissioner for Refugees. And it really is global solutions that we're looking at. In terms of the global picture, there are today more than 60 million refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons worldwide. 10 years ago, that figure was 38 million. The numbers are really quite dramatically changing. When I started working with UNHCR in 2009, there were 6,200 staff. Now there are over 9,000. It's another 3,000 staff taken on in 5 years. In the last 15 years, we've had, or even less, the last 5 years, 15 new conflicts have erupted worldwide. 5 years ago, every day, 11,000 people were freshly displaced. Yet last year, it was 42,500 every single day, new people displaced around the world. The crises in Syria and Iraq have displaced 15 million people. In the last 12 months, 500,000 people have fled their homes in South Sudan and nearly 200,000 in Burundi. 1.1 million were newly displaced in and from Yemen and 300,000 in Libya. And we also have displacement in the Asia-Pacific region with nearly 100,000 people crossing the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea last year. When he was addressing this situation in Europe earlier this week at UNHCR's annual meeting with member states, the High Commissioner for Refugees reflected on the situation in Europe in 1956. Then 200,000 Hungarians fled to Austria and Yugoslavia. They were properly received, and in just 4 months, over 150,000 of them were relocated to other countries, including here in Ireland. What was possible then should be possible now. We must remember as well, when we reflect on the enormity of the figures that I've just talked about, that in 2014, over 80% of the world's displaced were hosted in developing countries. There is a perception that Europe and the industrialized countries are hosting the majority of the world's displaced, but that is not the case. Over 500,000 people arrived in Europe by sea at the start of this year. That is a very significant number, but in a continent of 500 million inhabitants, it's a manageable one, provided things are properly managed. The decision taken by European leaders to relocate 160,000 asylum seekers is an important step in the right direction. Some of you may have seen that the first group of Eritrean nationals recently left for Sweden from Italy. This is the first group of people to be relocated. And yesterday, the Justice and Home Affairs ministers met in Brussels to advance the implementation of the package, which was agreed on the 23rd of September. But much more is needed for these measures to work, and we still need more legal avenues for those in search of protection and for economic migrants to be able to access the European territory in safety and dignity. The crisis in Europe is both a refugee and a migration crisis. All of those arriving in Europe have human dignity and human rights that must be respected, like everyone else's rights. And within this, we must be clear that there are binding legal obligations on states to grant protection to refugees fleeing conflict and persecution. The arrivals in Italy this year are of a mixed nature involving migrants and refugees. The crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean is of a different nature, with a clear majority of those arriving in Greece coming from the refugee-producing countries of Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And I hope this conference will provide an opportunity to discuss the kind of responses that are required within the applicable frameworks. There are a differentiated range of solutions that will be required and joined-up thinking that will be required. I do want to quote, though, from our Assistant High Commissioner for Protection in his speech to UNHCR's annual meeting, Volker Turk, when he addressed this issue. And what he said was, with relation to the terms refugee and migrant, that they have been used interchangeably in the media and in the public discourse. The two terms have different meanings, and conflating them has serious consequences for the lives and safety of refugees. Both migrants and refugees are protected under international human rights law, but the failure to mention refugees specifically is a failure to recognise their unique predicament, the absence of national protection, the risks they face should they return home to their home countries, and our obligations to protect them under a legal framework crafted specifically for them. This can undermine public support for the institution of asylum at a time when more refugees need such protection more than ever before. And I think this will be an interesting discussion for you to have now over this afternoon and tomorrow around the different definitions and the different legal framework. But one point of clarification before I move any further on this, and that is that there is a protection regime which is made up of the refugee protection framework, which, as you all are aware, is when a person leaves their country of origin for fear of persecution on a number of defined grounds. There is another protection regime which is called subsidiary protection, and that entitles people who are fleeing generalised violence, the death penalty, or torture in their countries to avail of protection. Anyone coming to Ireland is able to apply for both of those forms of protection at the Office of the Refugee Applications Commissioner here in Ireland. So we have two different protection regimes that are a single procedure in all other EU member states, and in Ireland we have a twin track procedure for looking at those. But there is a broader protection framework as well, even beyond that. Beyond the 1951 Convention and the subsidiary protection regime, there is the international law rule of non-refoulement. A country cannot send back a person to another country where they will be harmed. This is known as a rule of international customary law. So if we're talking about the concept that Peter Sutherland was talking about earlier about survival migrants or people who might die if they're to be returned, these kinds of principles can come into play. We also have the European Convention on Human Rights. That's binding on the Council of Europe member states. They're much broader than the European Union. We have 40 plus members of the Council of Europe member states. They are bound to adhere to the right to life under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the right to freedom from torture, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment under Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So a state can't send somebody back to another country if they're not a refugee or they don't fulfill the subsidiary protection definition, if they would be subject to indefinite detention, for example, falling within Article 3, or if for whatever other reason their Article 2 rights would be infringed. All EU member states operate within that framework at the moment. And normally these decisions are taken during what's called the leave to remain process or the humanitarian leave to remain process, where ministers have a discretion that they exercise within that legal framework. So I think we have to be very clear when we're talking about protection, that we're talking about refugees, people who are eligible for subsidiary protection, and people whose fundamental human rights would be harmed if they were to be returned. So let's look at it in that term. And when we're talking about people not fitting within that definition, then we need to look at what is the legal framework for migrants who don't fit within those categories. And I would challenge you as well, when you're discussing these things, to think about the protection space. Should we be trying to preserve a protection space for people fitting within these protection regimes? Is there a valid ethical and moral public policy approach that we should follow to ensure that a protection space is maintained? Because if we are to argue that all people who wish to come to Europe should have access and that nobody should be returned from Europe for any reason, how are we to preserve that protection space? And when we raise these issues, it's very important also to recognise that all people, all human beings have human rights. Anyone on the territory of Europe is eligible to access their rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. But to maintain that protection regime, do we need to consider returns to third countries of people who don't need protection? Is that a necessary thing? And if so, how do we go about ensuring that that is done with due regard to people's human rights? From a UNHCR point of view, we would say that the protection space does need to be protected. There was a discussion about a safe third countries list. In principle, we don't have a difficulty with a list of safe third countries as long as it's a presumption that somebody can argue against or bring legal argument against if the situation is to the contrary. But we need to think about ways to preserve the protection space, and I would encourage you to try and engage with that in your discussions. One thing that brings together these two areas, let's call them the general protection area and the migration area, is the need for additional legal avenues for people in need of protection to access the European territory and for people who wish to move for economic reasons or other reasons. Traditionally, the protection reasons are the resettlement method of coming to other countries, or now the relocation method, or arriving and seeking asylum. And the traditional migration ones are work visas, student visas, family visit visas. In Ireland, UNHCR has warmly welcomed the commitment here to admit 4,000 asylum seekers and refugees under relocation and resettlement. We've also welcomed, as UNHCR, the Irish Syrian Humanitarian Admission Programme, which has granted permission to 114 Syrians to come to Ireland. There's a small number of Syrians who've arrived here in Ireland and applied for asylum under the regular asylum procedure. Their cases have been prioritised and they have all been recognised as refugees, unless there's been any question of disputed nationality in the case. Once the nationality is confirmed, they have all been granted refugee status. The Irish Navy has saved thousands of lives, rescuing over 7,000 people in the Mediterranean in recent months. And I'm delighted to see a member of the Irish Naval Service here and look forward to the contribution tomorrow. And the Irish state has contributed 41 million euros since 2011 in response to the Syria crisis. Last month, Ireland approved €1 million for the related crisis in Iraq. And at a time when the United Nations has been forced to cut food aid to Syrian refugees, Ireland recently announced a donation of €60 million in untied aid to the UN World Food Programme over the next 3 years. Combined with the outpouring of support from the public in recent months, these are significant and meaningful expressions of support and solidarity with refugees and with other EU member states on the Mediterranean coast. So these are all very good things, but I want to just finish with a specific example of the interface between the protection area and the migration area. Yesterday evening, my UNHCR colleagues and I had one of our regular catch-up meetings with the Irish Syrian community here. These are Syrians who have been in Ireland for many years, some more recently arrived. And we talk about the kind of difficulties and challenges they're facing. Many of them are highly skilled, consultant doctors, working for tech companies. There were 3 PhDs in the room, highly skilled people. They are having difficulties in accessing visas for their family members to come and join them. they are experiencing challenges in being reunified with their family. And we are working very closely with them, and they have a very good relationship as well with the Department of Justice, where we're trying to unpick these. These are very complex things. But I came away yesterday evening thinking, if it's challenging for this group, who are in a country that is supporting them, where they can meet with the minister when they need to meet with the minister, where they can meet with us when they need to meet with us, and we try and unpick these problems, how difficult is it for somebody with no access, with no language, with no access to UNHCR or other elements of power? So I think we really have to look at how we can enhance the legal avenues so that people who can reunify with family members, people who can bring their nephew from a refugee camp in Jordan in and provide them access to university to continue their education, how can those avenues be advanced? How can we ensure that more people who wish to migrate can do so in peace and safety? And how do we, in a coherent way, deal with this thorny issue of people in need of protection and people who may not be in need of protection without pitting those groups against each other? How can we take a constructive approach to all of these issues? They're difficult issues, and I'm delighted you have so many academics and practitioners in the room to guide the discussions, and I look forward to participating in those today and tomorrow. Thanks very much.